When I saw my husband holding my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not because I feared he would find out, but because I knew he would. I had forgotten to delete those messages. The ones that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. I reached for the phone, trying to snatch it from his hands, but he pulled back quickly and kept scrolling. I watched his face shift with every new line he read, his brows tensing, his lips pressing into a thin line, and I felt my world collapsing, second by second. Yes, he was about to learn the truth. But not all of it. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew he was closing in on the one message that would unravel everything. The one that would burn through the thin veil of denial and leave behind only wreckage. Or worse, confusion. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in his grip. A new notification flashed across the screen. I saw the color drain from his face as he read the name of the sender. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I developed when I'm nervous. The panic in my chest was mixing with a dull, dreadful calm. I could hear his breathing from across the room, ragged, uneven, loud. That was the moment I had feared the most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that changed everything. A mistake I thought I could bury. But now I don't know what happens next. So let me take you back. Let me tell you how it all started. And before I share the secret I've tried so hard to keep, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever held a secret so tight, so close, only to have it slip through your fingers in the end? I don't remember when we stopped touching. Maybe that's the saddest part. It wasn't one specific moment I could point to, just a slow, quiet withdrawal, like the tide pulling away from the shore. One day I realized we only brushed against each other by accident. In the kitchen. Passing through doorways. I'd reach for a mug, and he'd be there too, but neither of us reached further. He'd had surgery a few months earlier, nothing life-threatening, but enough to need time off work. His father moved in with us temporarily to help. I hadn't expected much, he was always polite, always on the fringe of our life. But in those first few weeks, something shifted. He noticed things my husband didn't. Asked about my days. Made small jokes. Nothing inappropriate, nothing suggestive. But it was more than I had. I didn't tell myself I was lonely. I thought of myself as practical, grounded. We were older, routines set in stone, emotions muted. But when I caught myself adding a touch of perfume before breakfast, or adjusting my blouse in the mirror, not for my husband, who didn't notice, but for the man who sat across from me at the table, I knew something was changing. It wasn't that my husband didn't care. He did, in his own way. But we existed like roommates, sharing a home, a schedule, a silence. Most nights, he fell asleep watching TV in the living room. I stayed in our bedroom, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. Sometimes I imagined us having a conversation. One where I told him how I felt invisible. But even in fantasy, he barely responded. A few weeks into his recovery, we rearranged some things. His sleep became light and restless, and the creaking mattress was keeping us both up. So we agreed I'd take the guest room for a while. It wasn't a fight. Just a decision made quietly, the way we made most decisions now. The guest room felt strange at first. Cold, disconnected. But after a few nights, I found a strange comfort in the solitude. No snoring, no television hum in the background. Just me and my thoughts, which had become louder than I wanted. One morning, as I stepped out of the guest room in my robe, I almost bumped into him, his father, in the hallway. He was wearing a soft gray t-shirt, barefoot, holding his empty coffee mug. We both froze. I laughed nervously and moved aside. He chuckled. Didn't mean to startle you. It's fine, I said. I just wasn't expecting anyone. Later that day, he offered to help me carry the laundry basket from the basement. I could have done it myself, but I let him. We walked side by side, and when his hand brushed mine to steady the basket, I felt something sharp and unexpected. Not desire. Just presence. He was there. I was there. And it had been so long since I felt seen. That evening, my husband went to bed early. Said he was tired, which he always was lately. I stayed up, reading, then wandered to the kitchen for tea. He was already there. Drinking chamomile. Couldn't sleep, he asked. No, I said. Too many thoughts. About what? I shrugged. Nothing important. You always say that, he replied. But you have that look. I didn't ask what look. We stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in gentle rivulets. It was quiet except for the ticking clock. The kind of silence that feels full, not empty. He turned to me, his voice low. You know, you're beautiful even when you don't say a word. I didn't know how to respond. I looked away. Pretended to sip my tea. I'm sorry, he added. That was probably inappropriate. No, I whispered, surprising myself. It's just unexpected. He smiled. Sometimes the truth is. He left first. Said goodnight softly, with a nod. I stood there for a long time afterward, the steam from my cup fading, the clock still ticking. I went back to the guest room, closed the door, and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. My skin tingled in places he hadn't touched. I didn't sleep well that night. But not because I was restless. Because for the first time in years, I felt awake. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I moved differently. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to notice, but inside, everything felt sharper. My skin buzzed with a strange sort of alertness. The hallway seemed brighter. The walls thinner. My robe suddenly felt more revealing than it had the day before. I kept tugging it closed, even though it hadn't opened. He was in the kitchen again. This time, I saw him before he saw me. I stood quietly for a moment in the doorway, watching the way he poured his coffee. There was something deliberate about the way he moved, as if he understood his body and space better than most men his age. When he finally turned and saw me, he smiled, just a little, and nodded toward the table. I joined him without a word. We sat in a silence that didn't feel awkward. It was the kind of quiet that stretched, not from discomfort, but from something still unspoken. A mutual knowing. Not an agreement, just something that didn't need to be explained yet. As we drank, he asked how I'd slept. I lied and said, fine. He looked at me for a second too long. That bed's not very comfortable, he said. It's fine, I repeated. I'll fix the frame. It squeaks. I heard it last night. I nearly choked on my tea. You heard it? He raised his eyebrows, as if surprised by my reaction. The house is old. Every noise travels. I nodded quickly, eyes down. I wasn't sure what noise he meant. I hoped he didn't mean my heartbeat. Later that afternoon, I busied myself with laundry. I didn't want to be idle. Idleness made space for thoughts, and I already had more than I could handle. The towels were still warm from the dryer when I began folding, but my hands moved mechanically. The smell of lavender detergent filled the room. Familiar. Safe. But nothing felt safe anymore. He entered without knocking. Need a hand? I opened my mouth to say no, but he was already walking over. We folded together in silence. His hands brushed mine again. This time I didn't pull away. I told myself it was nothing. That I was being ridiculous. That I was just craving attention. That these were harmless moments. But they weren't. That evening, after dinner, my husband sat in his usual spot, scrolling on his phone, his legs stretched out. The same posture, the same silence. I watched him from across the room and wondered if he ever thought about me beyond logistics, meals, medicine, sleep schedules. I remembered when we used to talk at night, before bed. When he used to touch my back, or kiss my shoulder just because. It felt like another life. One I was no longer living. I left him there and walked outside to the porch. It was cooler than I expected. I wrapped my arms around myself and stood by the railing. The wind moved the trees gently, and somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then stopped. Then I heard the door creak behind me. I didn't turn around. He stepped beside me, close but not too close. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. He nodded. "Yeah." That was it. Just yeah. As if he understood what I meant without needing me to say more. He leaned on the railing next to me, and we stared out at the darkness together. I could feel the heat of him beside me, a kind of gravity pulling at the edge of my self-control. "Your son, he's not a bad man," I said. "I don't even know why." "I know," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean he sees you." My eyes welled up without warning. I blinked quickly, looked up at the stars. "I don't want to be invisible," I whispered. "You're not," he said. "Not to me." I turned to him then. Slowly. He was already looking at me. His expression was steady, clear, but not forceful. We didn't say anything else. We kissed. Just that. Nothing more. It was brief. Barely a breath. But my entire body reacted as if I'd been struck. I felt the world fall away for a moment. The railing, the porch, the wind, all of it vanished. Only the electric thrum in my chest remained. Then he stepped back. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just looked at me, gave the smallest nod, and walked back inside. I stayed where I was. My fingers pressed against my lips. My breath shallow. I wanted to be angry at him. At myself. I wanted to pretend it didn't mean anything. But it had meant everything. The moment I walked back into the house, I felt it. The weight. The shift. Like something sacred had been broken or built, I wasn't sure which. My husband was asleep on the couch, a blanket across his lap, phone still in his hand. I stood there for a long time, just watching him. I thought he would never guess. But I also thought I would never be the same. The next few days passed in a blur, but not the kind that dulls the edges of memory. Instead, everything felt heightened, every second carrying more weight than it should. I found myself noticing sounds I'd never paid attention to, the quiet clicking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the rustle of newspaper pages as he read, the distant humming of the dryer. These small domestic details formed a strange symphony in my mind, one that only intensified the silence that hung between us. I didn't go near the porch. I avoided the evening tea. I kept to my room more than usual, claiming tiredness, headaches, errands. Anything that could explain my absence without raising suspicion. But avoidance didn't fix the restlessness that grew inside me. I started waking before dawn, sitting by the window, watching the sky shift from charcoal to pale gray. Sometimes, I saw him outside already, watering the garden, bending to pull a weed or two, completely unaware of my gaze. Other times, he looked up as if he knew I was there, and our eyes would meet for a moment too long. I told myself it had been just a kiss. A moment of weakness. An emotional slip. But I couldn't shake the sensation of it, how natural it had felt. Not stolen. Not frantic. Just true. I began journaling again. I hadn't done that in years. I didn't write about him directly, only fragments. Sentences that made no sense unless you read between the lines. The silence is louder than usual. There's warmth where there shouldn't be. I've remembered what it's like to feel seen. I tore the pages out afterward and burned them in the kitchen sink. My husband remained unaware. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he chose not to see the changes. That's what our life had become, a series of choices not to see. Not to ask. Not to confront. One afternoon, he suggested we all go out for lunch. I was surprised, and so was his father. We hadn't been out together in months. I agreed, mostly out of guilt, and maybe curiosity, curious about what we'd look like, the three of us, sitting at a table like a family. The drive there was uneventful. My husband spoke about his checkup, something to do with his medications. His father responded with polite nods and half-thought-out remarks. I stared out the window, pretending to be interested in passing trees and clouds. At the restaurant, I felt exposed. Everything suddenly felt more fragile, my words, my gestures, even the way I held my fork. I couldn't help but think someone could read us from across the room, like a book with pages dog-eared in all the wrong places. When our eyes met across the table, I looked away too quickly. But not quickly enough. His father lowered his gaze, as if giving me the choice to speak or remain silent. I chose silence. Back at home, I lingered in the driveway after we parked. My husband went in first, muttering something about emails. His father stayed by the car, opening the trunk even though there was nothing to retrieve. I walked over, pretending to adjust my purse. We stood there, not speaking, the heat of the day pressing around us. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Just tired." He didn't push further. He never did. That evening, I found myself drawn to the bookshelf in the den, running my fingers along the spines of novels I hadn't opened in decades. Most were from my college days, stories I used to love but never reread. One title caught my eye, something about beginnings. I couldn't even remember the plot, only how it had made me feel at the time. I took it to bed with me, not to read, but to hold. Something about the weight of it in my hands grounded me. The next morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. I changed shirts twice, then settled on a blue blouse I hadn't worn in years. It hugged me more closely than I remembered, made me self-conscious. Still, I kept it on. When I walked into the kitchen, his father looked up from the newspaper. His gaze lingered for a moment. Then he said nothing and returned to reading. But I saw his hands pause, the page held mid-air. Later that day, I offered to drive to the store. It wasn't necessary, we had plenty of groceries. But I needed to leave the house. To breathe. To move. To my surprise, he asked if he could come along. I hesitated, then agreed. We drove mostly in silence. The radio played something soft, forgettable. At one point, he rolled down the window, let the wind pour in. It tangled my hair, but I didn't mind. At the store, we moved slowly. Neither of us seemed interested in shopping. Instead, we drifted down aisles, pausing for too long at displays, picking up items we didn't need. We stopped at the flower section. He reached out, touched a stem of something orange and wild-looking. "You used to like these, didn't you?" he said. "I still do," I replied. He nodded and placed them in the cart. We drove back with a small bag of things we didn't need and a silence that felt heavier than the ride there. In the driveway, I didn't get out immediately. He didn't either. You're quiet, he said finally. So are you. He looked at me then, truly looked. We're not bad people, he said. You know that, right? I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because I wasn't sure what we were anymore. That night, I found the flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. He hadn't said anything. He didn't need to. And still, somehow, everything between us felt louder than ever. There's a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. I felt it the next morning, waking up long before the alarm that I no longer used. It was a weight in my chest that didn't lift, even as sunlight seeped through the curtains. My hands rested flat against the bed, unmoving, like they were bracing for impact. I stared at the ceiling for nearly an hour before rising. The blouse from the day before still hung on the chair. I touched it, remembered the way he had looked at me, not with lust, not with shame, but with recognition. As though he'd been searching for a version of me I had forgotten. And when he saw it, he didn't flinch. At breakfast, the atmosphere was functional. My husband scrolled through emails, occasionally sipping coffee and muttering about work-related delays. I nodded at all the right places, asked if he needed anything, and stood up to refill his cup before he finished it. The performance was familiar. I could do it with my eyes closed. His father entered the room later than usual. His hair was still wet, his shirt slightly creased, as if he hadn't taken the time to iron it. Our eyes met briefly, but there was no smile this time. Just a subtle acknowledgement, enough to remind me that we were still tethered, no matter how carefully we tried to hide it. After breakfast, I cleaned the kitchen meticulously, something I hadn't done in weeks. I scrubbed the counters until my knuckles ached, rearranged the spice drawer, even wiped the tops of cabinets no one ever looked at. I needed movement. I needed to burn through the buzzing that had settled under my skin. Around midday, I heard voices on the back porch. They were talking, him and my husband. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. It was even, cordial, but not warm. I stood behind the closed door for longer than I cared to admit, trying to decipher if they were speaking about me. I felt like a stranger in my own house. Later that afternoon, my husband left for a medical appointment. He mentioned it in passing, grabbed his keys, and said he wouldn't be long. I watched him from the window as he backed out of the driveway. The silence that followed was immediate and deep. I didn't move for several minutes. I simply stood there, staring at the empty space his car had left, feeling my pulse settle into something slower and heavier. Then I heard a sound behind me, a quiet footstep, and turned to see him in the doorway. He said nothing. Neither did I. We just stood there, the unspoken stretching thin between us like glass about to crack. I shouldn't be here, he said finally. His voice was low, quieter than usual. I didn't answer. But I am. We didn't move toward each other. Not this time. But the air shifted. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet, but in choices. In what we had already done. In what we hadn't said aloud. He walked past me, into the kitchen. I followed a few minutes later, not because I needed anything, but because I couldn't stay in that silence. He was pouring a glass of water. His hand trembled slightly. I think he suspects something, he said. It took me a moment to process. Why? He asked me how long I was planning to stay. And? I told him I hadn't decided yet. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge until my fingers numbed. We didn't do anything wrong. He looked at me then. Didn't we? I didn't have an answer. The day drifted slowly. I read half a book and remembered none of it. I watered the plants even though the soil was still damp. I changed the sheets in the guest room and remade the bed perfectly, smoothing each corner until there were no wrinkles left. When my husband returned, he seemed distracted. He ate dinner quickly, barely speaking. I watched him, wondering if he was measuring our words, our glances, our silences. That night, I didn't go to bed immediately. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the darkened television screen, my reflection staring back at me. The woman I saw looked tired, yes, but something else had crept in. A defiance. A flicker of self I hadn't seen in years. Eventually, I walked upstairs. The hall was quiet. My husband was already asleep, his side of the bed rising and falling in steady rhythm. I paused at the door, then turned away. In the guest room, I closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of the bed, and took a deep breath. Then I cried. Quietly. Without hysteria. Just slow tears that didn't need explanation. I wasn't crying because of guilt. Or fear. Or regret. I was crying because I knew I was changing. And I didn't know how to stop it. I don't remember falling asleep that night. I only remember waking up to sunlight spilling across the floor, warm and blinding, cutting across the guest room like a blade. The tears from the night before had dried against my cheeks, and my pillow held the weight of silence that no longer felt like rest. I lay still for a long time, letting the light hit my face. There was no rush anymore. I had crossed a threshold, and everything after felt slower, heavier, but sharper too. When I finally got up, I didn't reach for my usual clothes. Instead, I opened the old wooden dresser, the one I hadn't touched in years, and pulled out a soft green blouse I used to wear when we went dancing. The kind of fabric that floated around the skin, like it was designed to be remembered. I buttoned it carefully, one pearl snap at a time, and avoided looking at my reflection. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with mundane life, kettle whistling, chairs scraping, footsteps light against the floor. My husband was already gone. I heard the front door close minutes earlier. Another appointment. Another excuse to leave the house before it asked something of him. His father, stood at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug. When I walked in, he turned, startled. For a moment, he just looked at me. I could tell he was about to speak, but he stopped himself. He nodded instead, and I nodded back. Neither of us knew how to speak anymore without saying too much. The day passed slowly. We crossed paths like dancers rehearsing steps they didn't mean to remember. Small glances, quiet gestures, one of us reaching for the salt as the other handed it over, the backs of fingers grazing in passing. All of it wordless. All of it deliberate. That afternoon, I went to the garden. The heat was dry, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and earth. I crouched to pull weeds from between the rows of tomatoes, but my fingers moved without focus. I wasn't gardening. I was hiding. From the house. From myself. He appeared behind me sometime later, his shadow stretching across the soil. He didn't say anything. He just picked up the watering can and began moving from one plant to the next. I think I've ruined everything, I said without looking at him. You haven't, he replied. You don't know that. I know what I see. I turned to face him. And what is that? He met my gaze and didn't look away. Someone who's been invisible for too long. I swallowed hard, the back of my throat burning. I wanted to tell him that wasn't enough. That seeing someone didn't make it right. But I couldn't find the words. We stood in silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, we stepped closer. No one moved first. It just happened, like two magnets finally giving in. We kissed. No words. No hesitation. Just that, again. And this time, it wasn't a question. It was an answer. When we pulled apart, the world didn't collapse. The birds kept chirping. The breeze still moved the trees. But something inside me shifted permanently. We returned to the house separately, minutes apart. I changed clothes again, as if fabric could erase anything. But it couldn't. Nothing could. That evening, we sat down for dinner. My husband was back by then, cheerful in a distant way. He talked about new medication, a neighbor who had waved to him from the clinic parking lot. I nodded, listened, responded in all the right places. I passed the salad bowl. I poured his drink. I asked if he wanted another slice of bread. And all the while, I could feel the burn of memory sitting just beneath my skin. After dinner, I cleaned up quickly. Too quickly. My hands shook while drying the plates. My breath caught every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. Later that night, I went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. I searched my face for something different, some proof of what I had done. But nothing had changed. I still looked like me. That terrified me more than anything. Back in bed, I lay staring at the ceiling again, just like the night before. But now, my thoughts weren't quiet. They screamed. Loud and disjointed. Overlapping questions and regrets. Possibilities. I tried to picture my husband's face if he found out. I imagined his confusion, his silence, the way his hands might shake. I thought about what he would say, or wouldn't. But I didn't cry this time. There was nothing left to mourn. Only choices. And their consequences. There was a stillness to the next morning that felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. The usual hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of wood underfoot, the shuffle of someone moving through the hallway, all of it felt muffled, distant, like the house was trying not to wake me. But I was already awake. I had been for hours. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence speak louder than words ever could. There was no going back now. I had crossed the line again, not by accident, not with uncertainty. This time, I knew exactly what I was doing. And it terrified me, not just for what I'd done, but for how I felt about it. I got up slowly, each step toward the bathroom deliberate, as though my body had to relearn how to function under the weight of this new truth. I washed my face, avoiding the mirror, afraid of what I might see in my own eyes. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. A half-full cup of coffee sat cooling near the window. My husband's keys were gone. Another errand. Another escape. I made myself toast I didn't eat, stared out the window, and wondered how many people lived their lives like this, holding secrets that changed the shape of every room they entered. By mid-morning, the silence was broken by the distant sound of a lawnmower. I looked out to see him, his father, pushing it along the edge of the yard. He wore an old cap pulled low over his brow and moved with the kind of ease that only made everything feel harder. I stood at the window longer than I should have, watching him work, every movement so familiar now, so comfortable, it felt cruel. I wondered if he thought about what had happened the way I did, on repeat, in flashes, in echoes. When he came inside, his face was flushed, his shirt clinging to his back. He didn't look at me right away. Just walked past, poured himself water, and leaned against the counter with his eyes closed. I didn't say anything. I just stood across the room, still and quiet. Waiting. Finally, he looked at me. Not with guilt. Not with desire. But with something heavier. "We should talk," he said. I nodded, but neither of us moved. "I didn't plan for this," he added. "I know. And I don't want to make your life harder." "You're not," I said. But it wasn't entirely true. We both knew that. He stepped forward, slowly. "I don't know what this is. But I know it's not just a mistake." The words sat in the air like smoke. I didn't reach for them. I couldn't. My mind was too full of everything else, the way my husband's eyes scanned me lately, the shift in his tone, the way he lingered a second too long before leaving the room. That afternoon, I drove to the market. I didn't need anything in particular. I just needed to be out, somewhere I could be anonymous, surrounded by strangers who didn't know what I had done. The drive helped. The rhythm of the road, the quiet hum of tires on pavement. I took the long route home, stopping at a small cafe we used to visit in better years. I sat alone at a corner table, sipping bitter coffee, watching people walk by the window with bags of fresh fruit and small children tugging at their sleeves. When I got back, the house felt different. Not empty, but expectant. Like it was holding a question in its walls. I walked through each room, touching things lightly, bookshelves, tabletops, door frames, as if they might give me an answer. Later that evening, my husband returned. He seemed distracted, eyes tired, shoulders slumped. We made dinner together, an unspoken truce in motion. Our conversation stayed shallow, weather, traffic, the neighbor's new fence. But underneath it all, I felt it. His watchfulness. His hesitation. Like he was reaching for a thread he couldn't quite find. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the hallway, barefoot, the floor cool beneath me. I ended up downstairs, sitting in the living room with the lights off, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the dark. He found me there. Not my husband. Him. He didn't ask why I was awake. He just sat beside me. Not touching. Not speaking. Just sitting. After a long silence, he whispered, "This doesn't have to keep happening." I looked at him, unsure if I felt relief or disappointment. "It already has," I said. "I know." Neither of us moved. "We're playing with something we can't fix," I added. "I think it was broken before we touched it," he replied. His voice was calm. Almost sad. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't just talking about the two of us. He was talking about the house. The people in it. The years. Eventually, he stood up. He didn't say goodnight. He just left. I sat there until dawn. And when the light came, I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. Only that I couldn't go back to who I was before. The day began with an emptiness that didn't feel accidental. I opened my eyes to the sound of nothing, no footsteps overhead, no low murmur of the news in the living room, no clink of dishes being rinsed. The house felt paused, as if it too were unsure what to do next. I lay there for a long time, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and my own shallow breaths. When I finally got up, the silence followed me down the stairs. The kitchen was neat. A note was left on the counter in my husband's handwriting. Out for the day. Back late. That was all. No explanation. No time frame. Just distance, disguised as routine. The chair at the kitchen table, the one he usually sat in, was pushed in slightly farther than normal, as though he'd left in a hurry. Or with intention. I couldn't tell which disturbed me more. His father wasn't in sight. I didn't hear him in the garage, or outside, or anywhere else. I walked slowly through each room, not calling his name, not searching exactly, just trying to find a shape in the space that matched how I felt. But the house didn't offer anything. It just stood there, full of walls and memory. I spent the afternoon moving without purpose, wiping down already clean counters, flipping through a magazine I didn't read, starting a task and abandoning it within minutes. Time wasn't moving forward. It was circling, replaying the last few days over and over in my head like film on loop. I found myself standing at the hallway mirror, not sure how I got there. My reflection stared back at me with tired eyes, but more than that, curious ones. I tilted my head. For a moment, I imagined what he saw when he looked at me. Not the woman I had been years ago, not the wife or the housekeeper or the nurse. But me, right now, imperfect, worn, and still wanting. It wasn't vanity. It was something else. A need to feel real. By late afternoon, the sky turned a dull gray, the kind that doesn't promise rain, just a heavy kind of waiting. I opened the windows anyway, let the cool breeze move through the rooms. It carried the faint smell of damp earth and pine. He returned just before dusk. I heard the screen door click gently behind him, the familiar sound of his shoes against the wooden floor. I didn't go to him. I waited. Eventually, he found me in the den. I was sitting on the edge of the couch, holding a photo album I hadn't opened in years. It was the one from our wedding. He paused in the doorway. I didn't look up. I thought maybe you'd gone, I said. I almost did, he replied. There was a long silence after that. Then he walked in, sat in the chair across from me. Not next to me. Across. As if to say, we need space, but we also need to be in the same room. I wasn't avoiding you, he said. I wouldn't blame you if you were. He ran a hand through his hair. I needed time to think. I closed the album gently, resting it in my lap. Did it help? I don't know. The room felt thick with unspoken things. I wanted to fill it, to explain myself, to say something wise or brave. But nothing came. He leaned forward slightly. Do you regret it? I looked at him. My throat tightened. No, I said, quietly. But I wish I didn't have to say that. He didn't flinch. Didn't look surprised. I don't regret it either, he said. And just like that, everything between us changed again. We didn't rush toward each other. There was no desperation. Just a slow, mutual gravity. When he stood, I stood too. We moved wordlessly through the house. I led him upstairs, not to the guest room, not to the hallway. But to mine. We spent the night together. There are no words I want to place after that sentence. No embellishments. No metaphors. Only the weight of what it means. The following morning was quiet in a different way. Not uncertain, not cold. Just still. I woke before he did, the light soft and filtered through the curtains. I watched him breathe, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that somehow calmed the panic building in my chest. I slipped out of bed gently, walked to the window, and stood there for a long time, watching the sky turn from pink to pale blue. I knew it wasn't going to last. I knew nothing about this would be easy. But for the first time in a long time, I felt present in my own life. And that, somehow, felt worth everything. The hours that followed were filled with the kind of silence that didn't ask for anything. No explanations. No reassurances. Just the still presence of two people who had crossed a line so quietly, so deeply, that even their footsteps sounded different. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, careful not to overstep what was already fragile. I folded laundry that didn't need folding. Rearranged things that had no reason to be moved. My hands were busy, but my mind was elsewhere. He stayed quiet that day. We didn't speak about the night. We didn't speak about what came next. He spent most of the morning on the porch, pretending to read, though I noticed he turned the same page 3 times. I watched from the kitchen, pretending not to. In the afternoon, I found myself standing in front of my husband's closet. The door was half open, his jackets hanging in the same order they always had. I ran my fingers over the fabric, touched the empty space where his winter coat should have been, remembered how I used to tuck notes into the pockets before long trips. It all felt like a memory from someone else's life. There was a strange clarity in those moments, an understanding that what had happened was irreversible. That even if no one spoke of it again, it would live in every corner of this house. Later that evening, I set the table for 3 out of habit. The silverware clicked against the plates, too loud in the quiet room. The light from the chandelier overhead made the space feel too formal, like we were guests in our own lives. My husband came home just before 7. He looked tired, more than usual. His eyes scanned the room quickly, as if trying to pick up on a story he hadn't been told yet. I greeted him the way I always did, the same tone, the same rhythm. He responded with a nod and a kiss to the top of my head. Dinner was slow. He talked about someone at work, a mistake in a spreadsheet, a meeting that ran too long. I nodded, smiled, asked the right questions. He didn't seem suspicious, but something in his gaze lingered longer than normal when I passed him the butter. Across the table, his father stayed mostly silent. He ate slowly, methodically, as if chewing helped him think. Our eyes met only once, and for less than a second. But in that second, I felt more seen than I had in the rest of the evening combined. After dinner, my husband went upstairs for a shower. I stayed behind, pretending to tidy the kitchen. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt him behind me. "I can't stay here," he said quietly. I turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "I mean this house. This arrangement. I thought I could keep it simple, just help out while he healed, be useful. But I can't. Not anymore." There was no anger in his voice. No blame. Just finality. "I didn't ask you to." "I know," he said. "But I also didn't ask to feel this way." We stood there for a while, not speaking, not touching. Just breathing in the same space. "I'll tell him I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't know what else to do. That night, I lay beside my husband in bed. He turned to his side quickly, like always, pulling the blanket over his shoulder. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, waiting for it to change. Waiting for a sign that he knew, that he felt it too. But it never came. I don't know when I fell asleep, only that I woke to the soft glow of dawn and the sound of the front door closing. I got up quickly, wrapped a sweater around me, and made my way downstairs. He was already gone. No note this time. No goodbye. Just absence. The kitchen was too quiet. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, both hands wrapped around the mug. For a long time, I just sat there, staring out the window, waiting for something, anything, to make sense. But nothing did. I wasn't sad. Not exactly. I was just aware, painfully aware, of what it meant to be in the middle of a moment you can never take back. And of how, no matter how quietly a person leaves, their absence always echoes louder than their footsteps ever did. I spent the next morning moving slowly, deliberately, as if rushing might cause the fragile threads of my world to unravel all at once. The air in the house felt different, and I couldn't tell if it was because he was gone or because I knew he wouldn't be coming back. His absence wasn't just physical, it had a texture, a presence of its own. A weight that settled into the corners of each room. My husband had already left when I came downstairs. No note this time either, but I recognized the pattern. He was beginning to disappear in his own way, through avoidance, through silence. And I was letting him. I made breakfast I didn't eat. Cleaned a counter that wasn't dirty. Rearranged the fruit bowl, then undid it. All the while, the emptiness behind me followed like a shadow. Around noon, I walked into the living room and paused. Something was off. The bookshelf. One of the picture frames was turned slightly. I picked it up and stared at the photo inside, our wedding day, faded now, worn at the corners. My smile looked wide and confident, but all I could see now was how young I had been. I put the frame back where it belonged, perfectly aligned, and stepped back. Then I saw the envelope. It was tucked beneath a book on the coffee table, half concealed but placed too carefully to be an accident. My heart started to race as I reached for it. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was neat. His. Asterisk. I didn't know how to say goodbye, so I didn't. I just want you to remember that sometimes the line between right and wrong is not where people say it is. It's where we feel it break. Asterisk. That was all. No name. No apology. No promise. I folded the note back and slid it into my pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't even sit down. I just stood there for a long time, holding that stillness in my chest like something sacred. Later in the afternoon, I noticed my husband's car in the driveway earlier than usual. The front door opened and closed, and I listened to his footsteps as they moved through the hallway. Slower than normal. He was searching for something. I stayed in the kitchen, back turned, pretending to look for a recipe in a drawer I hadn't opened in months. He entered a few minutes later. I didn't look at him. I saw his bag was gone, he said. I nodded. He left this morning. Did he say why? No, I lied. He didn't respond immediately. I heard him sit down at the table behind me. The air between us pulsed with all the things we weren't saying. I asked him to stay, my husband said. His voice was flat. Told him he could stay as long as he wanted. I turned then, slowly. And? He said he had things to take care of back home. That he'd stayed longer than he planned. Our eyes met. His expression was hard to read, part suspicion, part weariness. He didn't say anything else, he asked. I shook my head. No. The silence stretched. I could feel it pressing against the edges of my ribs. You've been different lately, he said. So have you. He blinked, caught off guard. I wasn't trying to hurt him. But I was done pretending nothing had shifted. I didn't mean to push you away, he added. I've just been dealing with things. I know. Another pause. Then, more quietly, I think we stopped talking a long time ago. Yes, I said. That evening, I sat in the guest room for the first time since that night. The bed was still made. The curtains still drawn. I ran my hand across the blanket, smoothed the creases that didn't really need smoothing. In the hallway, I heard movement, my husband, walking slowly, hesitating outside the door. But he didn't knock. He just stood there for a while, then walked away. I stayed in the room until it got dark. The only light came from the window, where the last bit of sunset faded behind the trees. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes just before something breaks. When I finally left the room, the hallway was empty. I turned off the lights, one by one, and stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up into the shadows. I thought about the note in my pocket. The way he'd written where we feel it break. And I realized something. The break had already happened. We were just living in the echo. There is a particular kind of emptiness that sets in when the truth is finally out in the open, even if it's only spoken through silence. The next morning, I lingered in bed long after sunlight had warmed the room, unsure whether I was waiting for something to change or simply dreading what might come next. I listened for familiar sounds, the quiet thump of a closing door, the kettle's whistle, footsteps in the hallway, but there was nothing. The house, for the first time in weeks, was truly still. I got up and dressed methodically, choosing an old sweater and worn jeans, clothes that felt neutral, invisible. I tied my hair back and splashed cold water on my face, bracing myself against the reflection that stared back. There was no revelation in the glass. No sudden understanding. Just me, a little older than I remembered, and impossibly tired. Downstairs, my husband sat at the table with a mug of coffee. He didn't look up when I entered, just kept tracing the rim of the mug with his finger. I poured myself a cup, took the chair across from him, and we sat in silence. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The words that needed saying were already between us, thick and heavy and unfinished. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Do you want to talk?" The words came out so quietly I almost missed them. I set my cup down. "I don't know where to start." He nodded, looking away, out the window. "Me neither." A pause. Then, "But I think we should try." So we tried. We talked, at first in cautious fragments, then in longer sentences. We talked about the last few months, about what had changed, about what we had each stopped saying. We talked about the surgery, the recovery, the way the world had narrowed down to routines and appointments, and how we'd both become smaller inside it. He asked, "Did you love him?" The question hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. I stared into my coffee, searching for something that wouldn't sound like a lie. "I don't know," I said, honestly. "Maybe. Not the way I loved you. Not the way I wanted to. But it was real." He let out a long, trembling breath. "Did you ever think about telling me?" "I did," I said. "But I couldn't. I was afraid you'd never see me the same way again." He nodded slowly. "You're right. I wouldn't have." There was no anger in his voice, just a kind of resignation. We both sat with that for a while. The house felt larger, emptier, as if the walls themselves had shifted to make room for all we weren't saying. The day moved slowly. We went through the motions, cleaning, cooking, answering a few calls from relatives, but everything was muted, as if happening underwater. I spent some time in the garden, pulling weeds with numb fingers, letting the cool dirt ground me. At one point, my husband came out and stood nearby, his hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything, just watched me for a while. Then he turned and went back inside. Late in the afternoon, I found myself in the guest room again. I opened the window, letting the breeze carry in the scent of cut grass and rain. I stood there, looking out at the yard, thinking about all the ways this house had changed shape over the years, how it had grown and shrunk with our lives, how it had held so many versions of us, some we'd outgrown, some we'd lost. Eventually, I sat on the bed, the envelope still in my pocket. I read his note one last time, then folded it and slipped it back inside. I wanted to feel something final, some sense of closure, but nothing came. Just a quiet acceptance, the slow settling of dust after a storm. That evening, we ate dinner together, just the two of us. We talked about simple things, the weather, the neighbor's dog, a recipe we both remembered from years ago. There was no laughter, no warmth, but there was no cruelty either. Just the tentative steps of two people trying to move through the aftermath. Afterward, I stood by the window, watching night fall. The lights from neighboring houses flickered on, one by one, each a small beacon against the dark. I thought about the choices that had led us here, about the lines we'd crossed and the ones we'd redrawn. I thought about what forgiveness might look like, whether it was even possible. Whether we wanted it. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the urge to run or to hide. I simply stood there, breathing, letting the night settle around me. Upstairs, I heard my husband moving about, the quiet sounds of a man preparing for bed. I climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at the doorway. He looked up, met my gaze, and for a moment we were just two people, wounded, uncertain, but still present. I lay awake for a long time that night, listening to his breathing, the rise and fall, the steady comfort of it. In the darkness, I wondered about the future, not with hope or dread, but with a kind of open-ended patience. There would be more conversations, more silences, more days like this. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew I would meet it honestly. And for now, that was enough.